I can't remember a Christmas without tradition. For as long as I've lived, my family's December rituals have been unchanging: warm cider by the fire, ornaments pulled from dusty attic boxes, and, of course, the grand expedition to find the perfect tree. This year, though, everything felt different. It wasn't just the biting wind or the low-hanging fog that seemed to follow us like a living thing. It was the sense that some unwelcome presence, had seeped into the fabric of our holiday. We'd driven farther than usual, Dad wanting a more authentic tree farm experience. The GPS had taken us to the edge of the county and then beyond, until we arrived at a nameless forest with a hand-painted sign reading, "Evergreens for the pure of heart." Dad joked about it, but I remember Mom's hesitation. "This doesn't feel like a business," she murmured, glancing at the towering pines. But Dad waved her off, ever the optimist. The trees were beautiful, tall and dense, as though they'd been plucked from a storybook. I wandered between them, marveling at their symmetry. Yet, there was one tree, near the back of the lot, that seemed to call to me. Its needles were a deep, unnatural green, and the branches moved faintly even though the air was still. I stopped in front of it, unable to tear my eyes away. "That one," I said, pointing. The vendor appeared as if from nowhere, a wiry old man with sharp eyes that seemed to catch the light in a way I didn't like. He nodded approvingly. "Good choice," he said. "She's been waiting for someone like you." "Someone like me?" I asked, startled. But he only smiled, a strange, knowing smile, and went to fetch his saw. It took longer than expected to cut the tree down, its roots clinging stubbornly to the earth. When it was finally loaded onto our car, the vendor handed my dad a receipt, though I'm certain I saw him scribble something onto the paper last minute. As we drove home, I felt the weight of the tree behind us, as though it were pressing its presence into the car. Mom commented on the fresh scent, but I stayed silent. I couldn't stop thinking about the vendor's last words to me before we left. "Be careful where you place her. She likes to be seen." When we arrived home, the tree was set up in the living room. At first, everything seemed normal. It fit perfectly into the corner by the bay window, where it cast long, soft shadows on the walls. We decorated it with our usual ornaments, and for a brief moment, I let myself believe that my unease had been nothing more than my imagination. That night, I woke to a sound. A faint creak, like wood bending under pressure. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The house was silent, save for the occasional groan of old pipes. But as I lay back down, I felt an unfamiliar tightness in my chest, a sense that I wasn't entirely alone. The next morning, I noticed the first oddity. The tree seemed taller. It was impossible to ignore the change in the tree. At first, I told myself it was a trick of perspective. Maybe the room made it look bigger than it had in the forest. But even Dad noticed. "Must have settled overnight," he said with a shrug, giving one of the lower branches a pat. "Happens sometimes." The explanation didn't sit right with me. Settling didn't explain how the branches stretched further than they had yesterday, or why the star on top was suddenly too low, looking awkwardly perched. That evening, we gathered in the living room for cocoa and carols. The tree was aglow with soft white lights, their reflection glinting off ornaments like tiny, watchful eyes. Dad put on his favorite record, the old crooner's voice filling the room with warmth. For a moment, the unease ebbed. We laughed, reminisced, and exchanged stories from Christmases past. Even Mom seemed more at ease, her earlier apprehensions softened by the familiar ritual. But as the hours stretched on, the atmosphere shifted. It started subtly, with the lights on the tree flickering ever so faintly. At first, I thought it was the wiring, until I noticed the flickers weren't random. They pulsed, rhythmically, like a heartbeat. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. "See what?" Dad replied, pouring himself another mug of cocoa. I hesitated. The room felt heavier, like the air was pressing down on us. The lights. They're strange. Mom glanced over. "It's just your imagination. You've been on edge since we brought it home." But I wasn't imagining things. As I watched, the shadows cast by the tree shifted, spilling across the walls in shapes that didn't match its branches. One moment they were jagged and sharp, the next smooth and looping, as though they were spelling something I couldn't understand. The carols on the record player slowed, the singer's voice dragging as if the vinyl itself had aged a century. "Turn it off," Mom said sharply, her unease returning. Dad got up to stop the record, but the moment his hand touched the player, a loud crack echoed through the room. We all froze, our gazes snapping to the tree. A long, deep fracture had appeared along the trunk, as though it had split from within. The lights blinked twice, then steadied. "It's just drying out from the heat," Dad said, his confidence sounding forced. "Trees do that indoors." He reached for the lights to adjust them, but as his hand brushed a branch, I saw it. The needles weren't needles at all, at least not anymore. They had lengthened, curling slightly at the ends like the fingers of a claw. A faint red sap oozed from the fracture in the trunk, its sticky sheen catching the glow of the lights. "Don't touch it," I blurted, leaping to my feet. Dad turned, startled by the urgency in my voice. "What's gotten into you?" But he stepped back all the same, his face pale. He'd seen it too. The room fell silent. None of us could look away from the tree, now seeming far too alive for something that had been cut down and carried into our home. That night, as the rest of the house slept, I crept into the living room, unable to shake the feeling that the tree demanded to be watched. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the lights, and in their flicker, the shadows danced. The ornaments swayed gently, though the air was still. One of them, a small porcelain angel, swayed more than the others, spinning slowly on its string. I watched, transfixed, as it turned to face me, its painted eyes staring into mine. I stepped closer, barely breathing. That's when I saw it. At the base of the tree, where the trunk met the stand, the roots had begun to grow back. By morning, the tree had transformed yet again. The roots, which I'd seen creeping from the stand during the night, were now fully visible, curling along the hardwood floor like skeletal fingers. They'd begun to crack the varnish, leaving faint trails that radiated outward in jagged lines. I thought about telling my parents, but something stopped me. It wasn't fear of not being believed, it was the tree itself. I couldn't explain it, but I felt watched. The very idea of speaking about it, of acknowledging what I'd seen, felt like opening a door I wasn't ready to step through. Instead, I lingered in the living room, studying the changes in silence. The ornaments hung heavier now, the branches sagging under their weight. The lights seemed dimmer, their soft glow replaced by something colder, more metallic. And then there was the smell. At first, it was subtle, a faint, earthy musk. But by mid-afternoon, it had grown stronger, filling the room with a damp, decaying scent that reminded me of wet soil and something else, something sharper, almost metallic. Mom noticed it too. "We must have brought in a bad tree this year," she said, wrinkling her nose. "Maybe it's rotting from the inside." "I'll take a look tomorrow," Dad replied, though his tone was far from convincing. Tomorrow. Always tomorrow. But I wasn't sure we had that kind of time. That evening, I resolved to stay awake. If the tree was changing during the night, I needed to see it happen. I set myself up on the couch, a blanket draped over my legs, and a flashlight clutched in my hand. The house fell into its usual nighttime rhythm, Dad snoring faintly upstairs, the creaks and groans of settling wood, but I stayed alert, my eyes locked on the looming silhouette of the tree. At first, nothing happened. Hours ticked by, the quiet stretching thin. I began to think I'd imagined everything, that maybe the sleepless nights and strange smells were just the product of an overactive mind. But then the needles began to move. It wasn't a breeze. The windows were shut tight, and the air was utterly still. Yet the branches shifted, swaying in an unnatural rhythm, as though responding to a force I couldn't see. I switched on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The ornaments glinted, their surfaces streaked with what looked like fine, pale threads. I leaned closer, squinting to see. They weren't threads, they were tiny roots, spiraling outward and embedding themselves into the branches. A sound broke the silence. Faint at first, like a distant hum, but growing louder with every passing second. It wasn't until it rose to a soft, rustling chorus that I realized what it was. The tree was breathing. Panicked, I stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table and sending the flashlight skittering across the floor. It landed at an angle, its beam illuminating the tree's base. The roots were no longer still. They writhed and twisted, spreading further across the floor like a living web. I watched in frozen horror as they crept toward the couch, their movements deliberate and unrelenting. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. Instead, I scrambled to my feet, knocking over a stack of magazines as I fled the room. Upstairs, the house was quiet. My parents were still asleep, oblivious to the chaos below. I wanted to wake them, to shake them from their ignorance, but something held me back. It was the tree. Even from the top of the stairs, I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive. It didn't want me to speak. It didn't want me to warn anyone. Because this wasn't just about the tree. It was about us. Morning came, but the house felt darker than it should, even with the weak winter sun trying to filter through the frost-laced windows. I hadn't slept. Every sound the house made during the night, every groan of the wood, every faint creak, felt tied to the tree's unseen growth. When I came downstairs, the living room seemed almost hostile. The tree stood taller than ever, its crown brushing the ceiling. The ornaments now hung at unnatural angles, some almost swallowed by the thickening branches. The lights no longer flickered cheerfully, but pulsed faintly, like the heartbeat of something alive. And then I saw the gifts. Neatly wrapped presents had appeared beneath the tree. I froze, counting them. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 boxes in colors that glimmered faintly, as if the paper itself was alive. We didn't put those there, did we? I asked cautiously, turning to my parents as they entered the room. Mom looked puzzled. Of course we did, she said, though there was hesitation in her voice. I mean, I don't remember wrapping them, but maybe your father. Not me, Dad interjected, his brow furrowing. You know, I haven't even started shopping yet. For a moment, silence descended. The three of us stared at the boxes, as though daring them to explain themselves. Well, Mom said finally, forcing a laugh, maybe we wrapped them early and forgot. You know how hectic this time of year gets. Her words didn't convince me, and judging by Dad's expression, they didn't convince him either. The day passed uneventfully, but the tension lingered, a constant undercurrent that none of us dared to address. I avoided the living room as much as I could, but each time I passed the doorway, I felt the tree watching me. That night, I dreamed, or at least, I thought I did. In the dream, I was in the living room. The tree loomed taller than ever, its branches now reaching out, not upward, clawing at the walls like skeletal hands. The lights pulsed wildly, casting the room in an eerie, flickering glow. And then the gifts moved. One by one, the boxes began to shake, their lids lifting ever so slightly. A faint, melodic hum filled the air, growing louder with each tremor. The paper peeled back, curling like autumn leaves, and from within emerged. I woke with a gasp, drenched in sweat. The clock read 2:12 a.m. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was terribly wrong. Grabbing a kitchen knife for reassurance, I crept downstairs. The house was unearthingly quiet, the only sound my own ragged breathing. As I approached the living room, my heart pounded in my chest. The gifts were still there, but they'd moved. Now they sat in a perfect line directly beneath the tree, their reflective surfaces gleaming faintly in the moonlight. I stepped closer, the knife trembling in my hand. Slowly, I crouched beside the nearest box and reached for the lid. The moment I touched it, the house seemed to exhale. A low, guttural groan reverberated through the walls, and the tree's branches trembled as though in anticipation. The box opened. Inside was not a gift, but something wrapped in dark, tangled roots. My fingers brushed against it, and a shiver ran through me. It was cold and damp, like something pulled from the earth. As I unraveled the roots, I realized with dawning horror that what I held was a doll. But this was no ordinary doll. Its face was eerily lifelike, its glassy eyes staring up at me with an expression of pure malice. The roots snaked around its limbs, pulling tight as though holding it prisoner or keeping it alive. Behind me, a creak sounded, and I whirled around. The tree moved. Its branches extended outward, the lights flickering in sync with the motion. The air grew oppressive, thick with an unspoken warning. And then, faintly, I heard it, a sound so soft it could have been imagined. Laughter. Not the joyous laughter of Christmas morning, but something darker, echoing through the room as though coming from the tree itself. I dropped the doll and ran, the sound of my own footsteps barely drowning out the chilling echoes of the laughter behind me. The house felt more like a trap than a home. By morning, the oppressive air lingered, heavier than ever. My parents, oblivious or determined to feign ignorance, insisted on their normal routine. Dad tried fiddling with the lights on the tree, muttering something about electrical surges, while Mom busied herself in the kitchen, humming carols with an eerie cheerfulness that felt almost forced. I couldn't stop thinking about the doll. Had I truly seen it? Or had exhaustion turned the strange events into waking nightmares? Still, the memory of its lifelike face, the roots clutching it like a forgotten artifact of some ritual, refused to fade. I resolved to act. After breakfast, I grabbed my coat and told my parents I was stepping out for air. The snow outside was thick, crunching beneath my boots as I trudged towards the edge of the woods where we'd found the tree. The forest was unnaturally silent, save for the faint whistle of wind through skeletal branches. The trail was easy to spot, our footprints from days ago still marred the otherwise pristine snow. As I followed them, the unease in my stomach deepened. The deeper I went, the more I felt watched. At last, I reached the clearing. It was just as I remembered, though somehow it felt darker, as though the sun couldn't quite reach this corner of the forest. The stumps of freshly cut trees jutted out like jagged teeth, but it wasn't the stumps that caught my attention, it was the other trees. They seemed closer now, their branches gnarled and twisted, weaving together overhead like a cage. Their bark was scarred, patterns etched into them that I could swear hadn't been there before. Strange markings, almost like faces frozen in silent screams. And then, the laughter. That same faint, sinister laughter I'd heard the night before. It echoed faintly through the trees, growing louder as I turned in every direction, trying to pinpoint its source. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. Only the laughter, rising and falling like a cruel melody. Then I saw it, a glint of red in the snow. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. Buried beneath a thin layer of frost was another ornament, round, shiny, and unmistakably from our tree. How had it ended up here? I reached for it, but before my fingers could touch the cold surface, the ground shifted beneath me. With a sickening crunch, the snow gave way, and I tumbled into darkness. I landed hard, the breath knocked from my lungs. When I opened my eyes, I was surrounded by roots, their tendrils snaking along the earthen walls of what appeared to be a cavern beneath the forest floor. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of decay. The laughter was closer now. I scrambled to my feet, the dim glow of the ornament my only source of light. As I turned, I saw them, figures, barely visible in the gloom, moving among the roots. Their shapes were indistinct, more shadow than substance, but their eyes burned like embers. They didn't approach. They only watched, swaying slightly, as though drawn to some unseen rhythm. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice echoing in the confined space. No answer. But from the darkness ahead came a soft rustling, a sound like leaves shifting in the wind. Slowly, something emerged, a figure, taller than the others, its form draped in tattered cloth that seemed to merge with the roots around it. Its face was hidden, but from beneath the hood came a voice that chilled me to the core. "You took what was not yours," it said, each word slow and deliberate. I don't understand," I stammered, backing away. "The tree," the voice continued, low and resonant. "You brought it into your home. You let it grow. Now it will take what it is owed." Before I could respond, the roots began to move. They crept along the ground like living things, curling around my ankles, my wrists. I struggled, but their grip tightened, pulling me towards the towering figure. And then, just as the shadows began to close in, I woke. I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat, the room bathed in the soft glow of Christmas lights. But as I sat up, gasping for breath, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My hands were covered in dirt. I didn't tell my parents about the dirt. I didn't need to, they wouldn't have believed me. Instead, I cleaned myself off and kept quiet, but the weight of what I had seen, of where I had been, hung over me like the oppressive stillness before a storm. The tree was taller that evening. There was no denying it now. Its crown brushed the ceiling, and its branches sprawled outward, almost predatory in their reach. The ornaments gleamed in the soft glow of the string lights, but I couldn't look at them without feeling the cavern's damp air on my skin, the shadowed figures watching me from the roots. As night fell, the unease grew unbearable. Something had to be done. While my parents slept, I crept into the living room. The tree loomed, its faint pine scent laced with something metallic, almost coppery. I gathered my courage, grabbed the axe Dad kept for firewood, and stood before it. "You don't belong here," I whispered, my grip tightening on the handle. The house seemed to hold its breath. I raised the axe, ready to sever the trunk, but before the blade could make contact, the ornaments began to rattle. A low, guttural sound, almost like a groan, emanated from deep within the wood. The lights flickered. The branches moved. Not swaying like a tree in the wind, but bending deliberately, reaching towards me. The axe fell from my hands as one of the branches coiled around my wrist, its bark rough and cold. From the center of the tree, a face began to emerge. At first, it was barely perceptible, a faint impression in the bark, but it grew more distinct with each passing second. Hollow eyes, a sharp nose, a twisted mouth, features carved in anguish and malice. "You took me," the voice from the cavern rasped, but now it came from the tree itself. "I didn't know," I cried, struggling against the branch's hold. The face contorted, its wooden lips curling into something like a sneer. Ignorance does not absolve you. The forest was my domain, and now, this is yours. The room grew darker, the lights on the tree dimming until they were nearly extinguished. The ornaments reflected the faintest glimmers, but they were no longer festive. They shimmered like malevolent eyes, watching, waiting. "I'll take it back," I shouted, panic rising. "I'll return the tree to the forest." The grip on my wrist loosened, but the face did not disappear. "Return it," the voice said, each word dripping with menace. "But it will not leave unchanged." It took all my strength to drag the tree outside. The snow was deep, the night bitterly cold, but I didn't stop. The branches scraped against me as I hauled it back through the path we had made days ago, its weight growing heavier with each step. By the time I reached the clearing, the moon was high, casting an eerie glow over the twisted trees. I dropped the tree in the center and stepped back, my breath visible in the freezing air. "Take it," I said, my voice trembling. "It's yours." The forest seemed to shift around me. The ground beneath the tree opened like a yawning mouth, roots and soil swallowing it whole. As the last branch disappeared, the air grew still, the oppressive weight lifting. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then I saw them. The shadows among the trees. They stood in silent rows, their ember-like eyes fixed on me. And from the depths of the forest came the same faint laughter, a reminder of the pact I had unknowingly made. I turned and ran, the sound of cracking branches echoing behind me. When I finally reached the house, I bolted the door and collapsed in the hallway. The living room was empty now, the space where the tree had stood bare and lifeless. But something lingered, a faint scent of pine, a soft rustling that I couldn't locate. Christmas morning dawned quiet and gray. My parents, oblivious to the night's events, marveled at how peaceful the house felt. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't peace. It was absence. The ornaments were gone, the tree was gone, but the forest had left its mark. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the laughter, faint and distant, growing louder as I closed my eyes. I never went back to the woods. But every Christmas since, a single ornament appears on our mantle, a delicate glass sphere, shimmering faintly with a light that seems to come from within. I've tried throwing it away, smashing it, even burying it in the snow. But it always returns, a silent reminder that the forest never forgets. And each year, the laughter grows closer.